The Martin 167 Maryland was an aircraft as successful as it is underappreciated. Rejected by the US Army Air Corps, this multi-purpose machine would find success and affection at the hands of British, French, and South African pilots. Despite appearances, it was remarkably fast and nimble for its size. It fulfilled a variety of roles, and it even managed to do quite well in air-to-air combat, as it was often underestimated. As it saw most of its service either during the Battle of France in 1940, or during the various Mediterranean and early African campaigns of 1940 to 1941, its successes were often overshadowed by the early defeats suffered by the Allies during the Second World War. Today, we're going to attempt to correct this, and take a brief look at the history of this underappreciated aircraft. Its story begins in 1937. The US Army Air Corps was looking for a new aircraft to perform the roles of ground attack and light bombing. Previously, this role had been fulfilled by a lightly armed single-engine attack aircraft, some examples being the old-school but venerable Curtiss Falcon, the innovative but rubbish Curtiss A-10 Shrike, and the innovative and quite good Northrop A-17 Nomad. This latter aircraft had only just entered service in early 1936, earning a good reputation for itself, and it now formed the bulk of the Air Corps' ground attack force. Unfortunately, its career was destined to be short-lived. Advances in airframe design, power plant development, and lessons dissimulated from military exercises convinced the Army that a twin-engine design would be more suitable for their needs. A twin-engine aircraft offered multiple benefits. Two powerful engines would allow the aircraft to carry a heavier useful payload. This meant more guns, more bombs, and a larger aircrew. A larger aircrew meant that the aircraft could be equipped with appropriate defensive weapons, something which was a challenge for smaller designs, and the pilot would no longer be overloaded with all of the mission responsibilities, as things like navigation could now be delegated to the second or third crewman, which left the pilot free to do, well, the piloting. Thus, in 1937, when the Army Air Corps issued requirements for a new attack aircraft, they stipulated that only twin-engine designs would be considered. Along with this, their requirements included a top speed of at least 200 miles per hour with a full combat load, a minimum bomb load of 1,200 pounds, and a minimum range of 1,200 miles. By mid-1938, the Army had received several submissions, and eventually 4 prototypes would be built to be assessed. There was the Boeing Stearman Model X-100, the Douglas Model 7B, the North American NA-62, and the Glenn Martin Model 167. The 167 was designed by James McDonnell, yes, that McDonnell, and it would be one of the last things he would do with the company before moving on to form his own aircraft business in 1939. It was completed in a matter of months, receiving the Air Corps designation of XA-22, and it made its first flight on March 14, 1939. The XA-22 was a sleek cantilever monoplane with a semi-monocoque fuselage. As was becoming standard practice, the whole airframe was clad in a smooth duralumin skin, except for the control surfaces which were covered in fabric. Power was provided by a pair of Pratt & Whitney twin Wasps, each delivering 1,100 horsepower and driving 3-blade Hamilton standard propellers. This was the -37 variant of the engine, which came with a single-speed supercharger. Now, supposedly, this engine was chosen over newer, more powerful designs, such as early examples of the Wright Twin Cyclone, because the focus was on low-altitude performance. However, sources do conflict on this reasoning, and some state that the engine choice was more a financial decision rather than a performative one. The XA-22 was designed to be operated by a crew of 3. The pilot sat in an enclosed cabin in the forward section of the fuselage. Along with being in charge of the aircraft's controls, he also had 4 wing-mounted .30 caliber Browning machine guns at his disposal, This was meant to be used for strafing soft targets such as trenches, ammunition dumps, that sort of thing, but as we would find out later on, they also were very good at bringing down enemy aircraft as well. The Bombardier/Navigator sat in the glazed nose, which came equipped with a Norden bomb sight. The Bombay itself sat behind the pilot and was operated electronically by the Bombardier. It had a capacity for 1,250 pounds, which wasn't massive, though it did meet the minimum requirements, and this was meant to be supplemented by wing-mounted racks, which would bring the total capacity up to just under 1,800 pounds. Supposedly, these racks were to accommodate either bombs or torpedoes, but in service, the Martin Maryland rarely made use of them, and as far as I'm aware, torpedoes were never used offensively, although it appears some were used for a practice demonstration, and normally just the internal payload of 1,250 pounds was the most common configuration. The final crew member was the radio operator/defensive gunner, who sat in a compartment behind the bomb bay. Here they had access to 2 defensive machine guns. One was in an unpowered, retractable dorsal turret, and the other was kept behind a streamlined ventral hatch, which was opened when needed. The dorsal turret was a unique feature of the prototype, and this would not be included on production models later on, being replaced by something slightly different that we will get to later. When completed, the XA-22 was an impressive design that promised high performance, but this had come at a cost. To maximize streamlining and reduce drag, the fuselage was made as narrow as possible. This meant that the 3 crew compartments were entirely separate, so if the pilot was incapacitated, there would be no way for the Bombardier to get into the cockpit and take over control, which was something of a problem. To address this, a folding set of flight controls were built into the Bombardier's compartment, which admittedly made the already cramped nose borderline claustrophobic, but at least it gave the plane a fighting chance of survival. Interestingly, this was not a unique feature to the XA-22, and many late interwar aircraft built by both the United States and overseas featured this compromised layout. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. Following its initial test flights, the XA-22 was then flown to Wright Field in Ohio for official evaluations by the Army Air Corps. Despite the XA-22 performing well, achieving a top speed of 280 miles per hour, the Army gave preference to the Douglas Model 7B, despite the fact that it had actually crashed during a demonstration flight 2 months earlier, and was thus not even present at the evaluation. This was due to an update in Army requirements made in early 1939, and a revised version of the Douglas aircraft had been promised with a bomb load of at least 2,000 pounds, hence why it was selected over the Martin option. Glenn Martin, however, was not perturbed by this ill news at all. At the start of 1939, before the prototype had even flown, the company had already received a production order courtesy of the French Purchasing Commission. 115 aircraft were ordered as the Martin 167F, the F standing for France. They, along with export models of the Douglas DB-7 and other aircraft, were to help bolster the ranks of the adventurous and eclectically equipped bombing fleet of the French Air Force. As Glenn Martin had no orders from the US Army, this gave the company complete freedom to commit to the French order and make any changes to the design that were requested without having to make any consultations at home. Changes were requested, and the model built for the French Air Force differed from the XA-22 prototype in a number of ways. The engine was swapped from the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp to the Wright Cyclone. Initially, this resulted in a drop in power, as earlier models were equipped with 950 horsepower engines, but later on the power output of the prototype would be matched and then slightly exceeded. To compensate for the initial loss of power, further refinements were then made to the streamlining of the fuselage, and the fully retractable dorsal turret was replaced by a much lighter semi-retractable version. These changes paid off, and the top speed of the aircraft actually increased from 280 to 288 miles per hour. Other changes included the provision of French metric instrumentation, Belgian-built 7.5mm FN machine guns in place of the Brownings, and the aforementioned external bomb racks were installed to increase the offensive payload, though again this was rarely put into practice when the aircraft were in service. Owing to the growing desperation of the French Air Force in 1939, the entire order of 115 aircraft was to be delivered by the end of the year. This was the first time that Martin had faced such demand, and it necessitated a crash expansion program of their Baltimore-based factory. The day after the French contract was signed, bulldozers and construction workers rolled up to Martin's factory in Baltimore, and after just 77 days, the entire facility had been doubled in size. Now, doubling the workforce to match this was a bit more challenging, as a lot of the American aircraft industry was rapidly expanding at the same time, and competition for qualified workers was fierce. Martin took a local approach, hiring apprentices and training recent graduates of Baltimore's various high schools and colleges. The result was that, for a brief time, the average age of a worker in this factory was just 17 years. Despite the heroic efforts of the company to meet French demand, the delivery of the aircraft fell behind schedule. This was partly due to production delays, as, oddly enough, getting barely trained teenagers to build and assemble fairly complex military equipment was bound to come with some teething problems, surprise, surprise, and partly because of the outbreak of war between France and Germany in September of 1939. This caused the US government to impose an embargo on all military exports, and the restriction on the French orders were not lifted until the end of October. This had also held up a follow-up order for 100 additional French Martin aircraft, which were then duly rushed into production as quickly as possible. Known by the French as the Glenn Martin Model 167A-3, the 3 standing for 3-place attack aircraft, the first crossed the Atlantic for delivery towards the end of December 1939. Their entry into service would be delayed and somewhat chaotic. The aircraft were delivered, disassembled in crates, and the French had them not assembled in France, but in the relative safety of Morocco. Now, this was a decision that was actually made before war had even broken out between France and Germany, because the Martin aircraft that were being supplied to the French were originally to be operated by the French colonial forces, not metropolitan France itself. The French army was far more enamored with the Lioré et Olivier Leo 451, which admittedly was a very good aircraft. Now, unfortunately, not enough were available when war broke out with Germany, and they had to quickly change their plans. The original plan for the Martin 167 was to have a fully equipped assembly plant in Casablanca. The aircraft would be built, tested, and then flown off to various colonial bases. Now, instead of that, they would just be sent directly to metropolitan France. Unfortunately, French optimism outpaced French logistics, and the assembly plant was little more than a glorified repair shop. An ill-supplied glorified repair shop, in fact. The first major airframe parts had arrived by Christmas Day 1939, but the oxygen and radio systems didn't arrive until February, and the bomb release system, a somewhat critical component, wasn't arriving in quantity until the beginning of May. You know, when Germany was beginning its blitzkrieg against France in earnest. And so, when things truly kicked off between the French and the German air forces, the French only had 78 operational Martin aircraft, and most of these were still located in Morocco or Algeria. Still, despite this poor beginning, the Martin 167 would go on to perform very well in French service. Their operational numbers would quickly grow, and they were well liked by their crews. Though it was originally developed for ground attack and tactical bombing, the French would employ the 167 almost exclusively as a medium-altitude level bomber. Often known simply as the Glen, the 167 was operational with 4 major bombing units by the 10th of May 1940. 2 of these were still based in Africa, but they were hastily transferred to northern France and commenced their first missions against the German army on May the 22nd. The following 3 weeks saw the Martin 167 thrown right into the thick of the main fighting, with the type flying 363 combat sorties. That averaged out to each bombing group flying approximately 5 missions every day, pretty much around the clock. These missions were conducted against staging points, bridgeheads, armoured panzer columns, supply convoys, and various railway depots. Combat losses were notable, but not severe, with 17 aircraft being brought down during this 3-week period of insanity. Most of these were victims to anti-aircraft fire rather than Luftwaffe fighter cover. Indeed, in comparison to combat losses suffered by other aircraft types operated by the French, including the beloved Leo 451, the Martins got off relatively light. However, when the Luftwaffe gained its air superiority, which admittedly didn't take long, the Martins would begin to suffer considerable losses on the ground. Large numbers of aircraft would be destroyed or severely damaged by strafing or bombing attacks. The situation then became even worse following Italy's entry into the war in the middle of June, which forced the French to divert many aircraft to the new Italian front. 55 sorties would be flown against Italy for the loss of 1 aircraft before the signing of the armistice on June the 25th. Following this event, the Martin 167 would then find itself serving on both sides of the war, and often in the same operational areas. Following the fall of France, the unfulfilled deliveries of Martin 167s would be taken over by the British Purchasing Commission. Meanwhile, Vichy France would operate the remaining aircraft they had in the metropolitan region, as well as those which had been delivered to overseas holdings as well as the French Navy. From June 1940, Britain began to take delivery of 75 French 167s, with the RAF giving it the designation of Maryland Mark I. These were immediately re-engined with the original twin Wasp engines, as they were in greater supply than the Wright Cyclone and thus made maintenance more viable, and the French equipment, notably the metric instruments, were replaced by British Imperial instrumentation instead. Most of these 75 aircraft were flown in non-operational duties, with many being used for assessment by the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm. This then led to the decision to order a modified version from Martin as the Maryland Mark II. But a few of the Mark I's did find their way into an operational unit. Some were flown by No. 771 Squadron for long-range maritime patrol missions over the next 12 months, leading to the detection and assault and sinking of many enemy vessels. One of these missions led to the discovery that a certain German battleship named Bismarck had left the Nordic fjord in which it had been lurking, and, well, we all know how that particular adventure ended. The majority of British service would, of course, be seen by the Maryland Mark II. This had an improved version of the twin Wasp engine that came with a 2-speed supercharger. Not only did this boost high-altitude performance considerably, but other refinements in the design led to an overall increase across the board. Top speed was now at least 316 miles per hour, the climb rate had improved, service ceiling was now 30,000 feet, though without heating that was very uncomfortable, and it could now carry a bomb load of 2,000 pounds. 150 Maryland Mark II's were ordered, and they were all destined for service in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, with the first deliveries being made in March of 1941. From that date, the Maryland would see regular frontline service over the next 2 years, being flown by both the Royal Air Force and the South African Air Force. More often than not, it would be operated as a long-range armed reconnaissance aircraft rather than as a bomber. Indeed, the first unit to fly it in the Mediterranean, 431 Flight, based out of Malta, achieved some of the type's greatest exploits. Many of these involved one Wing Commander Adrian Warburton, though at the time he had not yet achieved this lofty rank. When first assigned to 431 Flight, Pilot Officer Warburton had a poor reputation for flying twin-engine aircraft, and a nasty tendency to ground loop anything. But that seemed to change with the Maryland. Its high speed, responsive controls, and compact frame made it feel more like a fighter than a twin-engine attack aircraft, and something clicked, and Warburton was able to bring out the best of the Maryland's qualities every time he took it up into the air. During his time flying the aircraft, he took it on numerous daring and near-suicidal reconnaissance missions, one of which involved flying at mainmast height whilst his crewmen hastily drew sketches of the Italian fleet that was moored at Taranto. That particular mission was then followed up the next night by the famous raid on Taranto. The reconnaissance data that which they had gathered had been deemed critical. But his exploits were not always as passive as reconnaissance missions either. On numerous occasions, Warburton got into engagements with enemy aircraft, and thanks to the Maryland's forward-firing machine guns, and its surprising nimbleness, he would score 5 air-to-air victories, making him a flying ace, and the type's only flying ace. Now, while Warburton was skimming along at 20 feet above Italian warships, the Mediterranean Sea, or the African coast, and believe me, it's a story I really want to tell in the future, during the period of 1941 to 42, other Marylands also put in very good service. The South African Air Force operated the type above the skies of Kenya, Egypt, and various other sections of the Mediterranean theatre, often in consort with the RAF. Many of these aircraft would form reconnaissance units during Operation Battleaxe, the brief and ill-fated British offensive against the newly arrived German Afrika Korps. As the Africa campaign ebbed and flowed, the type was used for the occasional tactical bombing raid as well, but for the most part it was far more suitable as a reconnaissance aircraft, mostly because it could actually defend itself when the Germans sent up fighters to chase it away. Multiple Marylands would score victories against German and Italian aircraft, either with their forward or defensive guns, and despite a lack of protective armour or self-sealing fuel tanks, usually considered a fatal weakness in the European theatre, they were able to absorb more damage than their air crews had supposed. This led to the decision to briefly employ the Maryland as a heavy fighter toward the end of 1941. Due to a shortage of the Bristol Beaufighter, Marylands from numbers 12 and 21 Squadron, South African Air Force, were sent to hunt down German transports flying between Crete and Africa. They were moderately successful, but the presence of cannon-armed Bf-110 heavy fighters meant that the squadrons lost just about as many aircraft as they shot down. The Maryland continued in service as a reconnaissance aircraft and part-time combat plane throughout 1942, but even by the start of the year it was becoming clear that its career was drawing to an end. The emergence of the powerful Bf-109F, combined with the lack of replacement airframes, meant that the number of Marylands available gradually decreased throughout the year. With the exception of a few units of the South African Air Force, the entirety had been retired by the end of 1942. They left behind a remarkably good reputation, receiving near universal praise from the air crews who operated them. And this was something that was mirrored by the experiences of the Martin aircraft that were operated by the Vichy French Air Force. Though operated in the same theatre, it's not known that the Maryland ever came face-to-face with itself in combat. The majority of these aircraft operated by the Vichy Air Forces saw action in West Africa or far over in Syria. This involved early combat around Dakar, where 167s, assisted by the French battleship Richelieu, pushed back a joint British and Free French assault. The type continued to be employed by a bomber for much of its service, unlike those flown by the British, and this would see the 167 conduct multiple sorties during the Allied invasion of Syria. These aircraft, operated by both the Vichy French Army and Navy, performed their roles as equally as those flown by the Allies, performing a mix of bombing and reconnaissance missions. However, weight of numbers was against them. In the early days of the campaign, the Martin 167 was instrumental in holding up the various Allied advances. But with the arrival of fighters such as the Hawker Hurricane and the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, losses began to rise, and rise, and rise. And by the end of the campaign in November, the already modest number of 167s that were based in Syria was reduced to an operational total of 0. Now, in a poetic twist, the French were the first to operate the Martin 167, and they would also be the last. Though the Vichy aircraft had been all but wiped out, those which had escaped with Free French forces saw continued operations throughout the entirety of the Second World War. Later on, based out of Allied reoccupied North Africa, Free French Air Force Martin 167s would operate a combination of liaison, reconnaissance, and bombing missions. These missions actually increased in frequency as the war progressed, with the most being flown between mid-1944 and May of 1945, which is a curious change of pace for an interwar design, as usually they are phased out of frontline service by this point. Admittedly, their use as bombers in frontline service at this time would be taken with the loosest definition of the word, as they weren't actually fighting frontline targets, they were instead targeting isolated pockets of German resistance, usually coastal fortifications, which had been isolated following the liberation of France. Following the war, any remaining aircraft in service were rapidly phased out, and as no examples survive today, it makes sense that a majority were scrapped. Some were kept on briefly as target towers for a time, but there is little documentation of their use following war's end. The Maryland's career was remarkably successful, especially for an aircraft which had been rejected by the US Army, and then only operated in modest numbers. In all, only about 450 Martin 167s were built, but they took part in numerous critical operations, many of which involved them conducting vital reconnaissance missions. However, its exploits are not necessarily its biggest legacy. Instead, it would be the aircraft that was developed from it. Though the US Army showed no interest in an improved version of the Martin 167, the same could not be said for the British. And, back in 1940, work had already begun on iterating the 167 into a more potent design. The result would be the Glenn Martin 187 Baltimore. It was one of the company's most successful aircraft, only eclipsed by the B-26 Marauder. Its history is as equally as obscure as the 167, but it was also equally as successful. However, the story of the Baltimore is one for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. I've been trying quite hard to keep these smaller overview videos more concise, but with any major production aircraft, this is proving to be a bit of a challenge. However, most of you seem to love longer videos, so I guess it's a win-win situation for me. I also apologize if my voice is a little bit off. I've had a bit of a sore throat recently, and it is why this video has been delayed. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. A return to our Q&A format is finally happening soon. Patreon questions get priority, of course. I'm just working out a few logistical things in the background, as it's a video format I plan to do with a camera, but there should be a video coming out at some point in early to mid-December. But that is all for now. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.